Welcome students. I'm Dr. Sonu Shiva, Associate Professor, Department of English, Government Tungur College, Bikaner. This session is for BA second year English Literature, paper first. And in this session, we'll be dealing with war poetry. So what this war poetry is, let's have a look. Definition. When we look at the definition of war poetry, it means not necessarily anti-war. So war poetry should not be considered as something which is written against war. It does address very large questions of life like identity, innocence, guilt, loyalty, courage, compassion, humanity, duty, desire, death. So some of the war poets have written this war poetry about the loyalty towards country, about the duty towards a nation, and a lot of other human emotions which are large questions of life. So war poetry does not necessarily mean that's going to speak against war. Who is a war poet? A war poet is a poet who participates in a war and writes about their experiences. So basically, war poet term is used for those poets who did participate in war, in World War I, and then they wrote about their experiences of war. But again, it is not necessary that only that poet is going to be called as a war poet who has participated in a war. Even a non-combatant, somebody who has not participated in the war, can also write a poem about war, and he is also called as a war poet. So this is the term that can be applied to a poet of any nationality writing about any war, including Homer's Iliad from around the 8th century BC. So war poet, this term can be applied to both the categories, somebody who has participated in war and someone who has not participated in any war but just writing about any war in any part of the world can also be called as war poet. But usually this term war poet is used for those poets who did participate in World War I. Early and late poets. So these war poets can be clearly divided into two parts, the early war poets and the late war poets. The early ones, for the early ones you can say that World War time can be divided into two parts, the early and the late poets. The first half from the outbreak of the war, that means when the World War started, to 1916, this is the duration of the early war poets, and the later half from 1916 to 1918. So this duration is for the late poets. And there is a clear difference in their ideas also, because when you read the poems by early war poets, you find that they write about the cause of war and they emphasize the abstract notions of honor. So somewhere you find that they are writing about their loyalty towards a nation, about the patriotism, and they are emphasizing this notion of honor, that it's so honorable to die for one's country. But when you look at the late war poets, they are more anti-war and they left this idea, this notion of honor and this notion of loyalty. Rather, they were writing about the details of war experiences or contrast abstract ideas with cold, hard reality. They were writing the cold, hard reality about death and destruction that is related to war. So you can see that there is a clear difference between the early and late poets. And here are the examples. The early poets are like Rupert Brooke, and he's an early soldier poet. He's equating good death with glory in his poems, and Wilfred Owen and Isaac Rosenberg, they are the later war poets. And what we find in their poems is the dirty, frantic, and painful nature of warfare. So this is the difference that you can see in the early and late poets. And these are the durations. That is early poets and late war poets. Elements of war poetry. So if we just want to look at elements one by one, what war poetry consists of, you can see them point-wise. War poetry epitomizes the dirty, frantic, and painful nature of trench warfare that we have already discussed, that how much death and destruction is related to any war. And war poetry does talk about this painful aspect of any war. And there's realistic presentation of death and destruction, because they are written by the real experiences of poets who have participated in the war. So the poetry, which is a war poetry, does represent the realistic presentation of death and destruction of war. Then there is compassion for soldiers. Soldiers' life have been full of hardships, and it is not an easy one. So in these war poems, you have that compassion for soldiers, that how much of hardship, how much of tough time they face when they are posted to any war place. Expression of anti-war sentiments. So because there is so much of death and destruction and pain attached to any war, so in war poetry you do find expression of anti-war. Then rich in images and onomatopoeic words. War poetry is rich in images. Images of war, images of destruction, images of death, and images of any place. War poetry has a lot of images involved, and onomatopoeic words. Onomatopoeic words are the words that relate to sound, like the din of war. The word like din, it's a sound word. So it's called use of onomatopoeia, because war is related with too much of sound. So poet uses a lot of onomatopoeic words. Now here's a little brainstorming and assignment for you. On the number 1, you have a question: should the war be glorified as something noble? So we need to think about this, because there is multiple dimensions in which you can look at this question, that whether war should be glorified as being very loyal to nation, or in the name of patriotism. Is war something very nice to have, or is it something which should be condemned because of the death and destruction it brings? So this is something that you need to think about, you need to brainstorm, you need to have different ideas about it. And there is an assignment: what is the difference between early and late war poets? So we have already discussed the difference between late and early war poets. What you need to do is you need to write in your own words the basic difference between the early and the late war poets. I hope you have understood what war poetry is. Thank you.